This presentation is being recorded and you are currently in listen-only mode. Now, without any further delay, I would like to turn today's meeting over to our presenter, Ian Holdsworth. Ian, you now have the floor.
Hi everyone, my name is Ian Holdsworth. I'm a consultant with Testhouse. Essentially, Testhouse is a software testing consultancy. We specialize in only doing software testing, so we don't do programming, we don't do project management, we just do software testing. We have offices bi-coastally in the United States, in London, in Dubai, and in Kerala in India. We also have operations centers in London, in Madrid, and again in Kerala in India. I said my name's Ian Holdsworth. I've been using Visual Studio for a number of years now, and I'm also currently running the content index for web performance testing for MSDN at the moment. So just to quickly go over the agenda, well, to start off with, we're going to have a little introduction and overview of what we're actually going to be viewing. Then we're going to look at web performance tests, and we're going to look at things like think times, validation rules, dynamic parameters. We're also going to look at doing recordings. We'll have demos on all of these, by the way. We'll be running and editing tests. We'll be doing validation rules, and also we'll be running a simulation. And then there'll be a Q&A session. So just basically for the overview, what we're going to start off by looking at is understanding HTTP traffic, how web recording actually works, and interpreting client requests in such a way that you can actually look at them and go, right, I know that one's failing because I haven't got this bit out of that one. It's very much marrying the two up together. We're going to look at recording and editing web tests. We're going to look at how the recording tool actually works, and obviously we'll be looking at the editing interface. And then we're going to look at think times, dynamic parameters, and extraction and validation rules. So to start off with, recording web tests. One of the important things to understand is how HTTP works. Essentially, HTTP is a text transfer protocol. It's an internet protocol that works essentially with text. So essentially all it is you send this bit of text to this URL, and it might send this bit of text back. Now normally these pieces of text are HTML files and just simple requests. So requests would normally be the URL, form post parameters, query string parameters. If you're dealing with web services, these could also include XML. There will also be certain other headers explaining what the content type is, what kind of compression has been used, and that sort of thing. But essentially, all the web recording is a list of requests. It's just a list of requests, and what the web test recorder will try to do is it will try to identify those parts of the test that are dynamic and try and pull out the sections of one request or the response to one request that you actually need to make up the URL and the query string parameters and the form post parameters of a subsequent request. One of the things to also bear in mind when you're actually running a web performance test is that it's not running in a browser. The only time you would actually a browser will be involved is during recording, when you're actually using an add-in called the Web Test Recorder. In fact, one of the common things that beginners really tend to find difficult is they go in to record a web test and there's no web test recorded there. Normally that's just because the add-in has been disabled. So you just need to re-enable that add-in. The main purpose of web performance tests is normally for generating load. You can do a certain amount of functional testing with them, but it's only to a very low degree, so most people don't bother. So essentially, because there's no browser involved, there is no client-side scripting, no images are rendered as far as the performance test is concerned. When you're actually viewing it, you may see renders of things that were downloaded. This is only because you're looking at the test results viewer, and that will try and actually render the page for you. One thing to bear in mind with that is it does not always resemble the actual web page, because it can only operate at the very base of the HTTP stack, and some things, particularly things like Silverlight, operate at different layers and are therefore not necessarily renderable by HTTP, sorry, by a web browser component. Okay, so the request tree, things that are captured, I've already gone over this slightly, but things that are captured when you actually get your requests, it will capture what the query string parameters are. It will also capture form post parameters and hidden fields. What it will not capture is images. It will download them, but it will not actually render them. It will download CSS, but it won't actually do any rendering associated with it. It will download any JavaScript associated, but it won't actually run any of it. Everything gets downloaded the same as it would normally. As I said, the main purpose is to actually simulate actual load. So you're writing a script to actually pretend to be someone actually browsing the internet and doing something on the internet. And the whole point is to actually try and simulate actual live load on an actual website. Some things are captured at runtime, although not always 100%. Things that are normally captured, redirects, 99.9% of the time it will capture redirects and it will do them. I've only ever encountered one website where it didn't actually redirect every time there was an actual redirect. Also, anything to do with how HTML should be decoded, so what version of HTML is being used, but only then. It's only then used by extraction and validation rules in order to actually try and get the data correct. So, moving smartly along. Okay, so first of all what I'm going to do is I'm going to go File, New, Project, and select Web Performance and Load Test Project. And I'm going to call it Training. Hope that there isn't one already there with that name. Find out in a second. Oh, there we go. What it's done is it's created me a training project, and in that training project it's created a blank web performance test. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to record. Sorry, actually let me just come back from that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a recording. So basically in 2010, sorry, in Visual Studio 2010 when you created one, it took you straight into creating a web performance test and straight into the recorder. What it does in 2012 is it just creates a blank web performance test, and you need to go in and add a recording. We'll be covering add recording in more detail a little bit later on. Okay, I'll just pause this and I can take you through. So we've got record, we've got a pause button, we've got stop, we've got an add comment button, and we've got a clear all requests button. And this essentially just runs in Internet Explorer as an add-in. So what you may actually get is you may get issues. If this doesn't come up, what you're probably running into is that the web test recorder has been disabled as an add-in. So you just need to go in and enable it. Okay, if I go and I click on record and I add a comment, you'll notice that it's automatically paused the recording. And I'm just going to go, right, okay, I'm going to load tailspin Sales Bin Toys database. I'm just going to click there and that should load it, and we should get the request coming in over here. So you can see the request that's been done. And then pause it again. Sorry. I'm going to add another comment. And I go click on model airplanes. Add another comment. Click on fourth coffee liar. Okay, I'll just click on there. Okay, I'm now happy with that. I've got about 3 requests there. That'll do me for now. So I'm going to stop that. I'm going to see it's created our web performance test, and it's now trying to automatically detect dynamic parameters. So what this is doing is this is rerunning the test just to see if it can spot anything that it can promote to a dynamic parameter. I don't think it's found anything, but no, doesn't look like it. No, it's found nothing. Sometimes that will tell you it didn't find anything, and what it's actually done is it's actually found 2 or 3 hidden fields, for instance. Okay, so moving on, just waiting for it to load. Okay, so now moving on slightly, we're going to look at actually running a web performance test. So what we're going to actually look at is we're going to look at the web test results viewer. So basically we're going to see everything that actually happens when you're actually running a web performance test. So if I actually just go straight in and okay, now that we've had a go at recording our web performance test, let's have a go at running it. So I'll simply right click anywhere on the performance test and select run. I can also here and select just run it from here, from the toolbar. And also debug it from the toolbar, which we're going to do a little bit more in detail later. We can run it with a pause before starting, and we can debug it. That's just so that if we wish to, we can single step through it. I'm simply going to run it in this instance. It appears to have all completed without any problems, and if we actually have a look, we can see that information we're getting back whether the test passed or failed to start off with. We're getting this HTTP status back. We're getting the total amount of time the request took to be sent off, the amount of bytes in the request. So if we were doing web service, then we might have additional information here regarding actually how much XML we sent in bytes, and we've got a total number of bytes in the response. That's the top panel, which basically just gives us for each request summarized information. Coming back down to the bottom panel, first tab we have is the web browser. Now you'll notice that the web browser actually appears to be not quite the same as how the website looked when we were actually viewing it in the actual web browser. This is because this web browser can only look at it from the bottom of the HTTP stack. It can't do like a real life browser can do and insert itself at any part of the HTTP stack. So for instance, some things will not render properly. In this instance, this site has rendered quite differently. You'll get some particularly things like Silverlight, which just won't render at all. But essentially you can get the basic information about whether you're on the right page and what page it should be. Also what you can do is you can have a look at the requests, so you can see what the headers were. what cookie information was being passed backwards and forwards, query string parameters, any form post parameters. You can also see the response, so you can see again what headers, in this instance in a much more raw manner, and also you can see what the HTML was, and if you want to, you can view the HTML in a HTML editor, so that it looks a little bit more meaningful. And for those of you who are actually used to actually editing HTML, this will be a preference, I would have thought, most of the time. We've also got what we call the context. Context is a group of string pairs which we use as variables. So essentially what we've got is we've got agent ID and its value is 1. We've got the agent name and its value is VSALM, so it's just calling itself after the machine it's on because we're just using the local one. We're using 100% weighting on it, and you can see there's lots and lots of these. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what we'd find is as we found dynamic parameters, those dynamic parameters would come up down here as and when we actually came across them. And if we actually have to pull them out ourselves, we will pull them out and store that information in here so that we can use it on a later request. What we also have is what actually happens. So we've got a couple of validation rules that are put on by default. These are what we call web test level validation rules, which basically just apply to every single request in a web performance test. This is the response URL one, and this is the response time goal. I'm not going to go into too great detail on these today. And that's running a web test. Okay, so that's running a web test. So let's have a couple of review questions. What things are captured during a web test, and what things are not captured? Well, things that are captured are the actual requests themselves, query strings, form post parameters. Certain things are kind of captured but not actually rendered, so they're downloaded but not actually rendered. And these are things like CSS, JavaScript, images, so they're not rendered, or if in the case of JavaScript they're not executed because we're not actually running in a browser. Why would you use comments during the recording? Well, essentially because it makes it much easier to read. If you don't put comments in, it can be absolutely horrendous trying to actually identify where one section of your web performance test starts and another one finishes. And it can be very, very difficult to find your way around because all you're actually looking at is something that's actually just an amorphous URL string. Quite often they can be almost to, for an entire web performance test, quite often the URLs as presented, unless you actually get into the query string parameters and the form post parameters, the URLs, with some websites, can be the same URL every single time. So you really need the comments in there to make it easier to read. What things are collected and specified at the end of recording? At the end of the recording, what it tries to do is it tries to identify dynamic parameters. So it will try and identify if you've got a field that's being used as a query string parameter in this particular request, it will look at earlier requests and see if it can find that value, and if it can it pull it out? What are the effective options that can be changed after playing the web test? Well, you can change the number of iterations, you can change what actual web browser you're actually testing with, you can turn think times on and off. Okay, so moving on. So editing the web performance test. In the web performance test editor, You have a number of options. You've got the run option. And if I just underline them as I'm going along, you've got the run option. You've got the add web recording option. So what this will do is, if you click on that, that will add an additional section of web recording. So it'll bring up the web test recorder and let you add onto the end. There is also an option if you actually right click on a request and go insert web recording, it will actually insert it at the position you are at when you actually right click. You can add a data source, so you can data drive it. So I mean, normally data sources that you would normally use would be things like, you would have user IDs, you might have other data that you actually want to use during the web test recording. You can add in a web request plugin. Now what that does is that will allow you to actually add a custom plugin, or one that you've downloaded from somewhere like Codeplex, for instance, to your web performance test. So that a web test plugin would be at the web test level, so it would effectively be affecting every single request in the web performance test. So a web request plugin, sorry, I'm getting them the wrong way around, that would be an individual request. And then up here we've got the web test plugin, which would be at the effective level of affecting every single request in the test. Moving on, we've also got to generate code. So what you can do is, if you have a very, very complicated web performance test, what you can do is you can take it and you can generate it to code. Now, what I generally prefer to do is I generally prefer to actually make a sub-web test, so you can actually modularize and go, right, I've got this little web test that's going to be called by these 3 different web performance tests. So it might be something that just goes and logs in, for instance. So you can actually modularize, and what I use that to do quite often is, instead of I need to use this in this web performance test, this web performance test, and this web performance test, actually I need to be able to code around this particular request. So what I will do is I will export it to a sub-web performance test, which is then called from the main web performance test, and then I will turn that sub-web performance test into a coded one so that I can actually get in at the source code level, but maintain the rest of my web performance test at the actual web, as an actual web test that can be edited using the editor. What we can also do is parameterize web servers. What this enables you to do is it will essentially turn each of the URLs, the base URLs of each request, into various references to context variables. So you might have 18 requests, of which you might only have 1 context variable. It just means that when you actually want to switch between your UAT environment and your production environment, you don't have to go through and change every single request. You can just change the context parameter. And also, when you're doing a load test, you can override specific context parameters with ones from the actual load test, which gives you the power of actually specifying within your load test which environment, for instance, you actually want to test against. Okay, as we said, at the end of recording, what it tries to do is it tries to promote dynamic parameters. Well, we can trigger that one by hand as well. So what you might want to do that after you've spent a while doing context parameters by hand, because sometimes that can actually help it along, and it will suddenly go, yes, because you've done this one, you've done this one, you've done this one, I can now identify this one, that one, and that one. So it's never 100%, but it does get some of them for you. And also you can set the request details. Basically, this is a way of editing the requests in a spreadsheet, in a tabular format, rather than going down in a tree format and then having to bring up the properties for each individual one, scroll down and find the property you want. the most common properties that people tend to update are presented in an actual tree format. In an actual table format. Okay, so let's have a look at editing a web performance test. Right, next I'm going to look at editing a web test. Essentially, we've got a number of buttons on our toolbar. I've already taken you through the RAM one. We've also got add a recording, which will add a recording at the end of our existing recording. We can also go in and we can insert a recording, which will insert it at the position that we've actually selected. So we can insert something in the middle if we so wish. We can also do things like adding transactions, loops, adding a call to a web test, so we can actually have a web test that's part of another web test if we like, which enables us to do modularization and things. But moving on, we can also add a data source. Now, the data source can be any kind of database that the actual system can cope with. Also, we can set credentials. Credentials would be user IDs and passwords where a website requires either Windows or Kerberos authentication. These can be bound to data sources as well, so we can actually have those varying depending on which actual iteration of the test is actually running. We can add a web test plugin. I'm not going to go into great detail about that today. A web test plugin is essentially overriding the overall running of the actual web test, so it allows you to get in and do additional things. We've also got a web request plugin that you can add, which allows you to actually go in and override aspects of an actual request. More simply, for most people, is the generate code. Now what the generate code does is it enables us to create a coded web test. As we can see, it just basically renders our existing web test into source code while we actually generate our requests. So that's our first request, specifies what the think time is. We'll go into think times a little bit later, and then executes the request. It does the same for the next request, and also in this instance is adding in a query string parameter. And again the same for the third one, and then essentially it runs both of them here and here. Yes, we'll keep that. Okay, so that's generating a coded UI. What we also have is a facility to actually parameterize our web service. So if we're actually not developing on the system we're actually going to finally do our tests on at a later stage, what we can do is we can create a context parameter for the actual web server that we're actually dealing with. And what this will do is this will actually identify all the different web servers that we're actually dealing with, and it will automatically generate a context parameter for us, which we can then go in and change. So I'm just going down, I'm going to create a context parameter, I'm going to go OK, and you'll notice down here we've now got a new option, which is context parameters, and we've got TS is equal to that, and anywhere where http www.tailspintoys.com was in any of the requests previously is now been replaced by the TS context parameter surrounded by double curly brackets. We can also promote dynamic parameters, which we saw when the actual web test was recorded. This essentially is not, well, it's unlikely to find anything at this point. And we can set request details. This just basically gives us, in a table form, some of the more commonly amended sections So essentially it allows us to get in, change our requests, our reporting names, which I'll cover in a little while, hopefully, and our think times, as well as our response time goals, which I'm not going to be going into great detail on today. Okay, whilst we wait for the slides to come back up. Okay, so moving on, what we're going to look at now is think times and presenting an accurate simulation. The whole reason we use what we call think times is to try and simulate an actual end user working away at a keyboard, at a browser, in order to enable the actual web performance test to simulate it properly. For that, what we have is think times, which essentially is just not everyone browses at the same rate. Some people will be very, very quick. Some people will be very slow. Some people might pause a bit over this particular page. Some people might really go, I'm in a hurry, I'm just going to click on here. The whole idea is we try and record the ones that we actually did when we were making our recording. And these we can go in and edit at a later stage so we can make them more reasonable. And when you're actually running your web test, your load test, in the end, so you're simulating 250 people all hitting the site at the same time, when you're actually doing that, one of the options that, actually the default option for when it comes to think times, is how you actually represent them. It will normally take what the default value, the default would be, is it would take the think times that you actually have and then plus or minus 20%. So it will add a random 20% or subtract a random 20%. Editing think times, there are a number of places you can go. We can edit them in the properties. So there we can see think times. We can also edit them in the test, in the table of actual test results, which will enable us to edit that. It will enable us to basically edit a number of different properties. One thing to remember is think times are always in seconds. So an accurate simulation. Okay, so if we want to actually have a look at think times, I select the request and go properties, and see think time for this particular request is currently set to 0. I'm going to override that and set that to 7, just to be on the safe side. But that's how many seconds it's going to pretend to think about it. If we actually have a look at some of the others, we should see that it's actually recorded what the think times are. So that one, yes, that one's 7. If I go on to the top one, and that's got a think time of 10. Okay, so if we actually now run the test, we can see that basically it's just dropped through. That's because I haven't currently got the think times set. I haven't currently got it set to actually monitor the think times. We can see now that the whole test passed. If I actually go into edit run settings, it will allow me to actually edit the run settings for this particular session. So whilst this particular session of the web performance test run is running, anything I change in here will stay valid. So if I say I want 2 iterations, and I want to change it to Firefox 3 and simulate think times, you can click OK. If I then just go over here and go run again, we can see now it's come over here, and what it's doing, because it's simulating think times, it's actually counting down. Now what we can do when we actually have a load test is we'll have a facility on load testing that will actually take that, count it down, but it will add or subtract 20% to the countdown. So basically it will add a variance of 20%, either add or subtract it to the countdown, and enable us to actually run it again. So and to basically to simulate how an end user might actually go about it. And we're seeing now, because I specified there were 2 iterations, it's going through the 2nd iteration. Now if we were data driving it, we might actually have the 2nd row at this point. Okay, so that's think times. So now moving on, let's take a look at dynamic parameters. I know I've kind of touched on these so far, but let's have a look at what they actually are. Essentially, when we talk about dynamic parameters, what we're actually talking about is things like session variables and other variables that are actually generated by the web server. So they might actually be done, it's a case of, because there's some code actually running on the server when it actually generates the page for your ASP.NET page or for your Java page, where because the code's actually running on the server, there are certain values that may well be dynamic that it uses to actually identify who you are. For instance, that would be the primary function of the basic session variable, but it might also be to identify what the current record you're actually looking at is. So when you're actually on this particular form, it would be there would be a session variable that actually says, well, this is this customer. And what you need to do is you need to actually be pulling these out and making sure you're using them in the correct places. So sometimes it will be just this form post parameter equals this context parameter, this context variable. Sometimes what it may well be is it may well be this form post parameter equals this constant with this actual context parameter embedded inside it. And how we do that is we use what we call a double curly bracket. So we have double curly bracket, context parameter name, close double curly bracket. And you can use this actual syntax almost anywhere within a web performance test. It basically just means when it encounters anything enclosed in double curly brackets, it will look in the context, it will try and find a context variable that actually equals the contents of those double curly brackets, and it will replace that whole section with what the value of that actual field is. Now, some of these ones it will detect automatically. I mean, it's normally pretty good at detecting hidden fields. It's also normally very good at things like form fields, and it will detect some parameters as some other query string parameters, but it's not going to detect them all. So you're going to need to actually get in there and actually identify these parameters and actually put them up into the actual request so that your request will actually run correctly. Because if you actually go through and you start running a request with your actual, if you leave the default session variable value as the constant that it actually recorded at, and then you rerun it the next day, the web server is just going to go, I'm sorry, that session timed out ages ago. It may well run for half an hour, when you're actually doing your actual recording and when you're actually tinkering with your web performance test. But when you actually come to run it the next day, what you'll find is that session variable will no longer be valid. So you need to actually identify them, pull them out. They'll normally be somewhere in the HTML. They may well be in links that you can identify. Essentially, it's just try and actually make the web performance test actually work, because the server at the other end is going to need this to know what it's got to actually feed you for your when you actually give it this request. If you haven't actually parameterized all your dynamic variables, when you actually go to actually do it, the server may well throw an issue. It may say, right, okay, I'm going to redirect you to an error page. What it may do is it may throw up the correct form, but with the improper data, because you've actually specified that it's this customer because you've left the default value in there, and actually you're deliberately trying to actually go for different customers in your web performance test to try and actually make it as realistic as possible. It is one of the things we try to do in order to make sure that we don't overuse the cache on SQL, also overusing the cache on other resources that may well be held on the server. So if it just does the same thing over and over, of course it's going to be really, really quick, because we're not actually moving about and using different areas of the system. So the dynamic parameters that are actually detected, a number of them, such as hidden fields and form fields, specifically things like ASP.NET's view state, are pretty much done automatically. Cookies, in the unlikely event that you actually need to worry about the value of cookies in your web performance test, this will normally be because the person who's actually written the web site that you're actually testing hasn't actually done a particularly good job and is calling a cookie value as a query string, which you should really never do. Query string parameters or form post parameters, well, query string parameters, it will detect some automatically. Form post parameters, if there's any values, it will usually detect those, and it will again detect those once the test is actually completed. One thing to bear in mind with hidden fields is hidden fields will always be done at runtime. So if the hidden fields actually change, then they will change for your web performance test. So if you're actually referring to hidden fields that are no longer there, which would quite often be the result of somebody's actually changed the site you're actually testing, or you haven't parameterized a previous request properly, so now you're actually getting things through that don't actually have the correct data on them, and so therefore don't necessarily have the correct hidden fields. Hidden fields is basically all done at runtime. None of it is actually stored in the actual web performance test. So it's a very good indication of if an earlier web request hasn't actually been done correctly. So moving on, dynamic parameters. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and detect some dynamic parameters. Now I've got my first 3 steps that I've recorded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a recording. So what this does, automatically it brings us into the web recorder, so the web test recorder. And what I'm going to do is I've paused it, and I'm just going to duplicate the 3 steps that I've already recorded. So I'm going to click on Tailspin Toys, I'm going to click on Model Aeroplanes, and I'm going to click on Fourth Copy Flyer. I'm then going to go click on record. I'm going to add a comment. So add to cart. I'm going to click on add to cart. There's another comment. Check out. I click on check out. it's already populated my file from a previous run. So not necessarily the most accurate data you'll ever see. Okay. So I'm just adding another comment to review order. Okay, and that's going to do me, I reckon. So I'm going to click that and go, okay. And what we should find is that it's detected all of these dynamic parameters. So what we do is we just grab them. Essentially all it's doing is it's going, well, on that checkout page there's a load of fields, so I'm going to extract the form fields for all those, because when we actually do that request they're going to be the parameters here. Okay, so that's dynamic parameters. Now moving on, what we should be discussing next should be extraction rules. Now I've already gone into extraction rules a little bit. And extraction rule, oh hang on, sorry, there's some review questions I'd forgotten about. When could you edit think times? You can edit think times any time after you've actually finished your recording. What is the principal purpose of setting credentials for a web test? If you have a web performance test, if you're using an actual application that requires you to log in with any proper authentication, I'm not talking about, oh, it's got a login page. What I'm talking about is you have to give it your Windows credentials, you have to give it your Windows, maybe perhaps your LDAP domain credentials or your Kerberos credentials. You can use those with the set credentials option. Why do we set think times? We set think times in order to represent an accurate representation of what somebody might actually be doing. So we're trying to actually give it an equal feel and make it feel like this is actually somebody using it. Okay, getting back to extraction rules. One of the reasons we use extraction rules is essentially to try and ensure that the test actually runs correctly. I've already gone into dynamic parameters to a certain extent. The main reason you will be using extraction rules is to actually try and identify which dynamic parameters you're actually going to be using. Sorry, which dynamic parameters you actually have. Essentially, what you do with extraction rules, you can use them for verification purposes, so you can say that your extraction rule is required, which will fail the test if it can't actually find the value. It stores it in a context parameter, and you can search for a number of items. You can search for form fields, you can search for just plain text. Actually, if I just plain text, you can get attributes, you can also get inner text from HTML, you can get the headers from your requests, you can use regular expressions, you can also use regular expressions on your text, and obviously you can get your hidden fields. Also, these are customizable, so you can actually create your own extraction rules if you so wish. Number of different things you can actually try and get. You've got selected option, which enables you to actually pull up a drop list or a combo box and go, right, I want the first option, I want the last option, I want the third option. Like I said, you can do tag in a text, you can extract attribute values, you can extract form field values again, HTTP headers, but only from the response. You can use regular expressions. Again, you can use regular expressions when you're actually extracting text. You don't have to, but you can. and it will do hidden fields pretty much automatically. Sorry, I'm rushing a little bit now because I think we're starting to run out of time. So, okay, so now we're going to do a demo on extraction rules. Okay, so essentially there are a couple of ways of doing extraction rules. What you can do is you can go into your request and you can go add an extraction rule. Okay, so here we can see the different options we've got. So select an option. So this is if we've got a combo box or a drop box. We can say give us the third one, give us the very last one, give us the first one. We can also pull information out of HTML so we can get the tag in the text. So that what that will do is that will track down the inner text of an HTML tag. We can extract an attribute value. So we can pull an attribute out of HTML. We can extract form fields, although normally these are done automatically. However, sometimes you will have to do them by hand. We can extract the HTTP header fields from the response. We can also do regular expressions, and we can extract text, which is what I will be demonstrating via an alternative method in a moment. So as you can see, we can specify starts with, ends with. We can make it case sensitive or insensitive. Again, we can also use regular expressions. Some of the common things you'll find on most extraction rules are we can specify an index. So we can specify to actually pull out the first instance that it finds that matches the criteria that we've specified, or you can specify the third. Or what we can also do is we can specify that we're just going to do it randomly. And also, if we know that we're dealing with HTML, we can specify that we actually want to do HTML decoding. So what that will do is that will essentially, if where things have been encoded up because there's special characters there, that should decode it back down again for you. Okay, I'm not actually going to demonstrate doing them by hand because there's a nice little automatic doing it. So I run the web performance test, and hopefully it shouldn't take too long to actually kickstart it this time. Okay, it's taking a little while, but yeah, there we go. So what we're actually doing is I'm just running the web performance test because I want to actually see my results for you. If I cycle up here and pick on this request, what I can do is I can pull up the actual response that's actually come back and say there's an actual piece of text that I actually want to verify. So I actually want to verify that this piece of text actually occurs in my web performance test. So I'm going to pull out that piece of text. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add an extraction rule. And if it finds any parameter values in the test that actually refer to that value, it will replace them with this param0, which is what it will automatically do. It will go param. If you've already got a param0, it will go param1. We can rename that though. So here we've got our param0. If I actually look at the properties of that, we'll see what it's done. Essentially, what it's done is it's just given there's an extract text extraction rule, and all it said is it's taken the 5 characters from after the bit of text that we wanted, and 5 characters at the start, so from the beginning, or just before the actual text that we wanted, and it's saying, look for these. So it will fill, if we run it again, if I just quickly close that one, and then go run test, should actually find is if I actually go in the context and go down, we should have extracted this param 0 value, and it now equals home dash tailspin toys. Now what you'd use this for is you would use it for pulling out information that you normally would need for a subsequent request. So there's a parameter that you actually need to pull the value out of. What you can also do is pull out information that you actually want to use for validation purposes at a later stage. And you can pull things out and report on them if necessary, although that's a bit harder. So if I close that and go back up here, like I said, what we can do is we can change that. So I'm going to say title, and I'm going to say that I don't want the first instance, I want the second instance. Bear in mind it is 0 based. So if I now run this test again, okay, and if I go into context and just slip down to the bottom, we've got this title, and you can see it's found an additional copy. Actually, what it's found there is it's got confused with some HTML, but that's okay because it still demonstrates what we were trying to achieve. Okay. And that's extraction rules. Okay, so now we're going to move on and we're going to look at validation rules. Essentially, validation rules are very, very similar to extraction rules, with the exception of instead of actually taking the value and parking it, what we actually do with validation rules is in the actual rule itself we have a value that we're actually going to compare it against normally, or we may be looking to see if a particular piece of text exists in a response. Again, the very similar options. We've got form fields, we've got text, we've got attributes, we've got headers, so you can get the HTTP response headers. We can use regular expressions. And obviously we can work with hidden fields for our validation rules, so we can see basically say if this hidden field equals this, then fail the test, or if this equals this, then pass the test. Again, we've got almost exactly the same options, but there are a couple of additional ones. If I just underline, we've got this response time goal. So what that enables us to do is specify how many seconds an actual request must actually be made in. So it must respond in this amount of time, otherwise the test will fail and that request will fail. We can also put these in at the actual test level. So any validation rule can be put in not only on an individual request, you can do them at the test level, which means that it will then be applied to every test in the actual web performance test. So every request in the web performance test. So response time goal. And we've also got response URL. Now what response URL does is when the test is recorded, it records the URLs that we're being sent back to. So when it's actually doing it, we record the URLs that we're being sent back to. Essentially, it just enables us to actually add another level of validation. You can, of course, turn these off. Or you can do one of the things you really need to do with this one is you just need to understand that some URLs, the expected URL will need to be parameterized. Okay, I'll move along. Test level validation rules. essentially apply to every single request that is at the top level of every single of every web performance test. It's also, you can also call them kind of universal validation rules. One thing about them, unless they've actually been written in such a way that they can be overridden, they generally can't. So if you put an actual validation rule in, you can't generally override it. Okay, I'm very, very quickly going to bring up the demo of validation rules, and that should be our last demo of the evening, or say afternoon. Okay, so what I'm now going to demonstrate are validation rules. Now, it's important to remember there's two levels that validation rules operate at. You can apply a validation rule to any particular request individually. So you can go into any request and go, I want to have this validation rule. What you can also do is you can go in at the test level. So if you go right up to the very root element of the tree and go add validation rule, you can add a validation rule to any particular, so to every single base level request in the whole tree. As you can see, we've got pretty similar options to what we had for extraction rules. Except we've also got these additional ones. We've got this response time goal. We've got response to URL, and you might have some bespoke ones here as well. Essentially, response time goal and response to URL are two that are normally added in by default. They add in additional properties on the request, which you can then specify. So response URL basically just verifies that the URL that is being sent back from the web server is the one that we expect it to be. What trips people up with this one and has them scratching their heads an awful lot is the fact that sometimes you actually have to parameterize the response URL, because the response URL will reflect things that are parameterized in the request URL. So when that happens, you actually need to parameterize the expected response URL as well. Response time goal just gives you a facility to say, well, actually, I want to fail the test if this particular request, or any request, as we're currently looking at it from the web test level. So if any base level request essentially takes longer than so many seconds to run, so you put in how many seconds, and then if anything takes longer than that, it will fail the test. I'm not actually going to do a test level one. I'm going to do a request level one. And I'm going to actually, if I just quickly go in here, because I want to cheat, view test result details. So nothing better than actually getting what you actually want to pull out and saying, right, is that bit, rather than you type it in and then it's not quite the same. So, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a validation rule. I'm going to go find text. As you saw, I've already copied and pasted it. So what we can also specify is we can obviously ignore text, so ignore case, we can use a regular expression, and we can specify whether the text should or shouldn't be found. Why you do it the other way around is potentially if you've got text in there that you want to fail the test, if invalid result actually occurs within the response, then you actually want to fail this test, for instance. If the word error occurs in the response, you want to fail the test. So things like that. Or you might want to search for 404, for instance, simply because if 404 comes up, that's probably going to be a HTTP result, and that's essentially going to be a dependent request that's actually not coming through. That would be unlikely normally. Okay, what we've also got is we've got this level option. And what this basically means is when you're actually doing a load test, you can specify what level you actually want to run your validation at. So if on your load test you specify high level, it will run all the low level, all the medium, and all the high level tests. If you specify medium on your load test, when it comes to actually running your validation rules, it will run all the medium and all the high level validation rules. If you specify low on your load test, when you actually come to do your validation rules, it will only run the ones that are marked as high level. It's just a way of filtering out different levels of validation that you actually want to do. So, for instance, for a smoke test, quite probably, you would only actually want to run your high level requests, so in your load tests, you'd specify low. It gets a little bit confusing, but it does make sense when you actually use it properly. Okay, so I'm going to save that, and I'm going to run my test. Okay, and as we can see, it all passed. But what I can also do is, if I go back in and I edit that, if you remember I said there was an option where we could actually specify, well actually we want to pass if found. We don't want to pass it if it's found. We want to exclude that. We want to fail the test if that piece of text is found. So just to demonstrate that quickly, I shall run it. And as you can see, it actually failed the test. And looking in there, if we go into the details, we can see there's actually nothing like the prohibited text Tailspin Toys appeared in the HTML response. So that, oh, hang on, can I just quickly go in there and actually turn that off, because that will fail next time I run it otherwise. So that is validation rules. Okay, so what we should hopefully have coming up any second is we're nearly at the end now. Almost there, and then essentially I'm just quickly going to mention some useful resources. So you've got the VSALM virtual machine that I was actually using to do the demo with. Oh, hang on. We appear to have actually slowed our content down a little bit. Is this because we've run over?
No, Ian, I've got your slide on the screen. Yes.
Okay, it's just Melanie hasn't. Okay, what we've also got is the content index for web and load testing blog. This is the one that I actually update on MSDN. We've got terraining solutions. We've also got DTDPS, which is Developer Tools Deployment Planning Services, which we also do quite a bit of work on. And then moving on. Any questions? I realise we haven't got much time left.
Don't think we have any questions today, Ian.
Right. Okay. If I just leave you with our thank you slide.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to go ahead and request control now so that you will soon see 4 quick poll questions in the presentation area. I'll scroll through them for a few minutes after the meeting. That'll give you a chance to answer. Your feedback is valuable to us, so please take a moment to answer these poll questions prior to logging out. As a reminder, you can request a copy of the slides directly from our presenter today in the IM window, or make a request to him via his email address at TestHouse. And I'd like to thank Microsoft partner TestHouse and speaker Ian Holdsworth for their presentation today. TestHouse presents Web Performance Testing in Brief using Visual Studio 2012. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's online meeting. Thank you for joining us, and once you've finished the poll, you may now disconnect. Thanks.